It was past 8 in the morning in the Kea Channel when the largest ship in the world gave her first slow lurch to starboard. She was the third sister of the Titanic, the last and the greatest of them. And yet this ship had been built for exactly this hour. Every lesson of that freezing April night was welded into her body, a double skin along her belly, watertight walls raised 40 feet toward the sky, boats enough for every soul aboard. She was meant to float with 6 of her great rooms open to the sea. 55 minutes after the blast, she was gone. Less than a third of the time her famous sister had taken to die. 1,066 people had sailed with her that morning. The question is not whether she was safe, it is what walked her under so fast. If you are drawn to the great ships and the disasters that swallowed them, subscribe and stay to the end, because what sank the Britannic so fast is not the mine, and it is not what most people believe. When the Titanic went down in the spring of 1912, she took more than 1,500 lives and every certainty of the age with her. For a generation, the men who built ships had told the world a story, and the world had believed it. The story was that steel had beaten the sea, that a hull could be made so large, so clever, so finely divided into sealed compartments, that no accident of ice or storm could ever put it under. The Titanic was the proof of that story, the floating cathedral to human confidence. And on her first crossing, she opened her flank on an iceberg and sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes while the band played and the lights burned down to the waterline. The story did not just fail, it drowned, and a whole civilization that had told itself the sea was a solved problem, a thing to be crossed in comfort and never feared, woke to the news that its finest and largest ship, the very proof of its mastery, had been undone by a single lump of drifting ice in the space of one dark night. The confidence of an age went into the water with her, and the men who had built her were left to reckon not only with the dead, but with the shattering of a belief they had staked their lives and their fortunes upon. What followed was not only grief, though there was grief enough to fill an ocean. What followed was fury and inquiry, and a cold, methodical shame. On both sides of the Atlantic, men in wood-panelled rooms took the disaster apart, plank by plank. They asked how a ship with 16 watertight compartments could founder from a single glancing blow. They learned the terrible geometry of it, that her bulkheads, the great steel walls meant to seal off the flooding, had been built up only so high, and that once enough of her forward rooms filled, the water simply climbed over the top of one wall and spilled into the next and the next, like water filling the chambers of an ice tray tilted slowly on its end. They learned there had been lifeboats for barely half the souls aboard, because the rules of the day counted boats by the ship's tonnage and not by the number of living hearts she carried. They learned that a ship called practically unsinkable had been, in truth, a beautiful and mortal thing. And while the inquiries sat, and the newspapers howled, and the widows of Southampton wore their black, there was a third ship. She was not famous. She was not even finished. She sat in a great gantry cradle at the Harland and Wolff yard in Belfast, on the very slip where her sisters had been born, a mountain of red primer and bare steel ribs, and she was the reason the story could be rewritten. She had been ordered before the Titanic ever sailed, the last of a planned trio, meant only to complete a weekly service across the Atlantic and to carry the rich and the hopeful between the old world and the new. She had a name already, chosen to ring like an anthem, Britannic. And because she was still half a skeleton on the day the Titanic died, she could be changed. She could be made to keep the promise her sister had broken. That is the thing to hold on to at the very start of this story, because everything that comes after turns on it. The Britannic was not simply another liner that happened to sink. She was the world's deliberate answer to its worst humiliation at sea. She was grief turned into engineering. Every fear that the Titanic had proven true, every flaw that the inquiries had dragged into the light, the men of the yard now had the chance to correct in steel, on a ship of the same blood and the same bones, before she ever touched the water. She would be the argument that it need never happen again. She would be the unsinkable ship, rebuilt to be truly unsinkable. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to make the men who built her into fools, to sneer at their confidence from the safe distance of a century, to shake the head at their arrogance in daring to call anything unsinkable. The film should not do it, because it would be a lie. The men who redrew the Britannic were not fools, and they were not arrogant. They were engineers in mourning, doing careful and honest work, correcting real flaws with real solutions, and by the standards of what they set out to do, they succeeded almost completely. The ship they built genuinely could have survived the Titanic's wound, and a good deal worse. Their confidence was not vanity. It was earned, calculated, tested on paper against the exact disaster they meant to prevent. And that is what makes the fall so hard to bear. This was not hubris punished. This was competence undone by a death it had never been asked to imagine. A blow from a direction no one had thought to armour, at a moment when the ship was not the buttoned-up vessel of the calculations, but a working hospital with her windows open to the morning. The best answer the age could give to its worst disaster was about to be proven not wrong, exactly, but beside the point. The White Star Line had reason to want that argument made, and made loudly. The Titanic had been more than a ship to them. She had been a statement of supremacy, a wager against their great rival Cunard, whose fast liners had held the speed records for years. White Star had chosen not to race for speed, but to win on size and splendour, to build ships so vast and so comfortable that a day and a half more at sea would feel like a privilege rather than a delay. The Titanic had carried that wager to the bottom of the North Atlantic, and with it, a great deal of the line's confidence and a great deal of the public's trust. The Britannic would have to carry both back up into the light. So the pencils came out again. The naval architects who had drawn the doomed lines of the Titanic now bent over their boards and drew the Britannic anew, and this time every stroke was haunted. Where the Titanic had a single skin of steel between her machinery and the sea, they would give the Britannic two. Where the Titanic's watertight walls had climbed only so high before surrendering, they would push the Britannic's higher still, some of them all the way up toward the open promenade, 40 feet and more above the line where the water lay. Where the Titanic had carried too few boats, the Britannic would carry a small fleet and great crane-like arms to launch them even if she lay over on her side. There was almost a religious quality to it, this rebuilding, as though by making one ship perfect, they could reach back through time and unmake the deaths of the other. She grew through the seasons that followed, a giant rising in the Belfast air, taller and broader than anything that had gone before her. Men who had wept over the Titanic now took a fierce pride in her younger sister. Here at last was the ship that would prove the age right after all. Here was the vessel you could look at and believe, without lying to yourself, that the sea had finally been mastered. She would be the largest British-built ship on the water. She would be the safest ship ever to leave a slipway. She would sail into a century that had learned its lesson. But the century she was being built for was not the century that would come. Even as her plates were riveted and her boilers lowered into place, the world beyond the shipyard fence was sliding, quietly and then not quietly at all, toward a catastrophe that would make even the Titanic seem a small and private sorrow. The Britannic was designed to be the answer to an iceberg. She was about to be handed to a war, and the war did not care how high her bulkheads climbed, or how many skins of steel lay between her boilers and the deep. It had a different kind of death waiting for her, one no naval architect in Belfast had drawn a single line to stop. She did not know that yet. Nobody did. In those first years, she was only a promise taking shape, the finest promise her makers could pour into iron. To understand how completely that promise would be broken, and how fast, you first have to understand exactly what they built into her, plate by plate, and wall by wall. Because every safeguard they gave her, every clever answer to the Titanic's death, would be there on her last morning. And one by one, in 55 minutes, the sea would find a way past every single one. The men who had drawn the Titanic now took their pencils back to the third ship and set about making her impossible to sink. It was a strange and somber kind of work, correcting the dead. Every improvement they penciled in was a confession, an admission that here and here and here. The earlier ship had been wanting, and men had died for the wanting. But they did the work, and they did it well, and the result was a hull so heavily armoured against her own drowning that on paper she should have been beyond the reach of any ordinary disaster. To feel the fall of this story, you have to first hold the height of it, and the height was this ship's defences. So listen closely, because each one is a loaded gun laid gently on the table in the first act of the play. Start with her skin. The Titanic had worn a single layer of steel, and where the ice tore it, the sea came straight into the rooms that mattered most, the boiler rooms and the engine spaces that were the beating heart of her. So the Britannic was given two skins. Along the whole length of her machinery, they built an inner hull inside the outer one, a second wall of steel standing back from the first with a void between, so that if the sea ever ripped her open, it would flood only into that dead space between the layers and find, behind it, another barrier still holding it out. It was the kind of protection a warship carried. To make room for it, they pushed her sides outward, widened her by a couple of feet beyond her sisters, and that extra breadth is a detail worth remembering, because it made her the broadest of the three and the heaviest, and in the end it would not save her at all. Then her walls. Inside every great liner ran a series of transverse bulkheads, steel partitions dividing the hull into a row of separate watertight rooms, so that a wound in one need not flood the rest. The Titanic had 15 such walls, and on paper they should have been enough, but they had a fatal shortness. They rose only to a certain deck and then stopped, and once her bow dipped and the forward compartments filled, the water climbed to the tops of those short walls and poured over into the next room along, and the ship pulled herself under one flooded chamber at a time. The Britannic's designers stared at that floor until they hated it, and then they fixed it. On the new ship, 6 of those critical bulkheads were carried up and up, past the decks where the Titanics had surrendered, some of them raised as high as the second deck from the top, 40 feet and more above the waterline. Raised that high, the walls could hold their water even as the ship settled deep. She was built, the calculation ran, to float with any 6 of her forward compartments open to the sea and full. 6. The Titanic had drowned with the flooding of her first 5. The Britannic was designed to shrug off a wound half again, as large as the one that killed her sister, and to sit there on the surface, wounded but alive, waiting for help. Set the numbers of her against the scale of a city, and you begin to feel what confidence like that was built upon. 29 boilers waited in her belly to raise the steam that drove her, and the shafts that turned her propellers were each of them thicker through than the trunk of an old tree. Her bulkheads climbed 40 feet above the water, the height of a house stood upon a house. 15 of those great walls divided her, and 6 of them were carried so high that no ordinary flooding could ever hope to climb over them. She could lose the whole front of herself to the sea, hold 6 of her rooms flooded and full, and still float. Every one of those numbers was a promise. Every one of them said the same thing to the men who read them. This ship will not sink. And then the boats, and the great arms that would launch them. This, more than anything, had been the true horror of the Titanic. Not that she sank, but that when she sank, there were seats for barely half the people aboard, and hundreds went down with her because there was simply nowhere for them to go. The Britannic would carry no such shame. She was fitted to hold a great fleet of lifeboats, dozens of them, enough in principle for every soul she could carry, crew and passengers together, with places to spare. But boats alone were not the answer, because the Titanic had proven that a listing ship could trap her own lifeboats against her side, unable to swing them out and down. So the Britannic's designers gave her something that looked less like ship's gear than like the machinery of a cathedral being built. Along her boat deck rose enormous gantry davits, tall electric cranes of curved steel, each one able to reach far out over either side of the ship, and to lift and lower several fully loaded boats at a time, and to do it even if she lay over at a steep and dying angle. 8 of these great towers were planned for her. The idea was almost tender in its ambition, that no matter how badly she was hurt, no matter which way she rolled, there would always be a way to get her people off her and onto the water. Picture her then, as her makers meant her to be. A hull doubled against piercing, a row of walls raised to the sky against flooding, a fleet of boats and the cranes to launch them against the last, worst moment. There was almost nothing the Titanic disaster had taught that the Britannic did not answer. She was not a ship that hoped to be safe. She was a ship that had been engineered, deliberately and expensively, and with the dead looking over every shoulder, to be the safest large vessel afloat in all the world. Her owners believed it. Her builders believed it. The men who would one day sail her believed it most of all, and had every reason to. But there is a cruelty hidden in that list of defences, and it is the cruelty this whole story turns upon. Every one of those safeguards was designed to fight a very particular death. They were built to fight the Titanic's death, the slow flooding from a long, low wound, the gentle settling by the bow over hours in the calm dark. They were the perfect answer to the last war. They said nothing at all about a wound that came in an instant from below, a single hammer blow of fire and water against her flank. They said nothing about doors left standing open at the change of a watch, or about windows opened a few inches for fresh air on a warm morning. The double skin, the high walls, the fleet of boats, all of it assumed she would have hours, and that the water would only ever try to come in from the places the engineers had imagined. On the 21st of November 1916, the sea would come at her from a place the engineers had never imagined, and it would give her not hours, but minutes. And every one of those beautiful defences, drawn in grief, built in pride, would stand ready and useless as a giant died around them. But that is getting ahead of the story. First, she had to be finished and floated and marvelled at. First, the world had to see her and believe. On a grey February morning in 1914, 48,000 tons of steel slid into Belfast Lough and floated. It should not, to anyone who has not stood beside such a thing, sound like a miracle. But it was. There is a moment in the launching of a great ship when the props are knocked away and she begins to move down the greased slip under her own colossal weight, faster and faster toward the water, and every man who built her holds his breath. Because until the sea takes her, nobody truly knows that she will float rather than break her own back. The Britannic moved down the ways that morning like a moving cliff, and the cold water of the lough rose up around her and lifted her, all 48,000 tons of her, as gently as a leaf. She floated. Of course she floated. She was the finest thing her makers had ever built. She was the largest British-built ship in the world. Take that in, because the numbers behind it are the measure of the fall to come. Her gross tonnage was 48,158, which made her larger than the Titanic by nearly 2,000 tons, larger than any liner that had yet been finished under a British flag. From the tip of her stem to the round of her stern, she measured 882 feet and 6 inches, an eighth of a mile of ship, so long that if you had stood her on end, she would have towered over almost every building then standing in the land that made her. She was more than 90 feet across the beam, broad enough for that precious double skin. That extra width, that handful of feet added beyond her sisters to make room for the second layer of steel, is one of the small ironies that shadow her, for it was added in the name of safety, and it made her the broadest and the heaviest of the three. And none of it would count for anything against the death that was coming. Deep in her belly, 29 great boilers waited to be fed, driving engines that could push all that steel across the ocean at better than 20 knots. She was designed to carry something in the order of 2,500 passengers in her 3 classes, and near 1,000 crew to wait upon them. A floating town of 3,500 souls, complete with its own streets and stairways and dining halls grand enough to shame a hotel on land. To grasp her size, forget the tonnage for a moment, and picture her stood on end against the world she was built in. Laid on her side, she was longer than almost any structure then raised by human hands in the whole of the British Isles. Stood upright, she would have loomed over the church spires and the factory chimneys of any city in the land. Her funnels were wide enough to drive a small train through. Her anchors weighed as much as a team of the heaviest horses. It took the labour of thousands of men across years to raise her, rivet by rivet, plate by plate, each rivet driven by hand and hammered home, millions of them holding her together. And when she was done, she was not merely a ship, but one of the largest moving objects that human beings had ever made. That is the height of the thing. Keep it in mind, because the whole weight of this story lies in the distance she will fall from it, and in how little time the fall will take. And here is the first of the ironies that shadow her, small beside the ones that are coming, but worth the pause. That floating town, built to carry the rich and the striving across the Atlantic in a splendour the Titanic herself would have envied, never carried a single fare-paying passenger in all her life. Not one. She was launched into a world that had, 6 months before, begun to tear itself apart. By the time she should have been fitting out her first-class staterooms and hanging the chandeliers in her dining saloon, the yards of Britain had been turned to the making of war, and the great liner sat at her berth in Belfast, complete in her hull, but empty inside, an unfinished palace, waiting for a peace that did not come. The passengers she was built for would never walk her decks. The crossings she was designed to make would never be sailed. She was the most magnificent liner of her age, and she was born just too late for the age that wanted her. It is a strange fate for a ship, to be the largest and finest of her kind, and never once to do the thing she was made for. She had grand staircases that no passenger in evening dress ever descended. She had public rooms fitted for a splendour that never came. She was, in a sense, a promise that history refused to keep, a vision of a golden age of ocean travel that the war swept away before it could arrive. And there is a shadow in that, a foretaste of the larger cheating still to come. For a ship that never got to live the life she was built for was perhaps always going to be denied the death her makers had prepared her for as well. She had been armoured with such care against a slow and survivable end, and instead, the war was reaching out to hand her a fast and violent one, in a place her designers had never so much as glanced at on a chart. She was cheated of her life as a liner. She would be cheated too of the safe and stubborn sinking she had been built to endure. Still, for those first months, she was a wonder, and Belfast knew what it had made. Men who had grown up in the shadow of the great gantries, who had riveted the Olympic and mourned the Titanic, looked at this third sister riding at her moorings and felt something close to awe. She was proof that the yard could still make the impossible. She was proof that grief could be forged into something magnificent. She carried in her very lines the promise that the disaster would not be repeated, that the next time the sea came for one of these giants, the giant would win. Nobody looking at her that spring could have believed that within 3 short years she would be lying on her side in a foreign channel, 400 feet down, the largest ship the world would lose in all the long slaughter of the war to come. Because the war was coming for her, specifically and personally, though it did not yet know her name. Out in the grey wastes of the North Sea and the blue reaches of the Mediterranean, a new kind of ship was learning to hunt, a ship that swam beneath the waves and struck without warning, and did not care in the least how high a bulkhead climbed. And a new kind of weapon was being sown across the sea lanes in their thousands, a weapon that sat silent beneath the surface and waited, sometimes for weeks, for any hull at all to blunder into it. The Britannic had been armoured against the ice. She was about to sail into a world of iron and fire, and the men who ran the war had a use for a ship so vast, so fast, so strong. They would not let her rot at her Belfast berth. They would take her, and they would paint her white, and they would send her to the very edge of the fighting, into narrow channels where the enemy had been busy in the dark. She was the answer to a catastrophe. Within 18 months, she would be dressed for a different one entirely, and given a new name, and set to work carrying the broken bodies of a generation home from the beaches of Gallipoli. The palace was about to become a hospital, and the palace never once suspected that the very features that would make her a merciful ship, the open decks, the fresh air, the windows thrown wide for the comfort of dying men, were the seams through which her own death would one day pour. She was still being fitted out when the guns of August turned every great liner into a pawn of the war. In the ordinary course of things, she would have spent 1915 taking on her finery, her carpets and her cutlery and her potted palms, and by the year's end, she would have made her maiden crossing to New York amid a blaze of newspaper praise. Instead, she spent that year sitting nearly idle in the north of Ireland, her hull complete and her insides bare, while the world she had been built to serve marched off to be slaughtered in the mud of France and on the beaches of a Turkish peninsula whose name would come to stand for a particular kind of futile courage. The Britannic waited, and then, in the autumn, the war remembered her. By the middle of 1915, the campaign at Gallipoli had become a wound that would not close. Men were being landed on those beaches and cut down in their thousands, and those who were not killed outright were maimed and fevered and broken, and there were far too many of them for the ships on hand to carry home. The army needed hospital ships, great fast ones, vessels that could steam out to the eastern Mediterranean, take on hundreds of stretcher cases at a time, and bring them back to England for care. And there, riding at her Belfast berth, sat the largest, fastest, strongest liner in the kingdom, empty and unused. On the 13th of November 1915, the Admiralty requisitioned her. The palace was going to war. What they did to her in the weeks that followed was a kind of transformation that carried its own quiet sorrow. The grand public rooms that had been meant for men in evening dress and women in silk became wards lined with iron cots. The first-class dining saloon, where the wealthy of two continents were to have taken their dinners beneath the chandeliers, became a place for the wounded to lie in long white rows. Operating theatres were fitted where the smoking rooms should have been. Her hull, which should have worn the buff and black of the White Star Line, was painted over entirely in white, and along each flank was run a broad band of green, and upon her sides and upon her funnels were painted great red crosses, so that she could be seen and known, from a distance and at night, as what she now was. A hospital ship, a ship of mercy, a ship that, under the solemn laws agreed between nations, no enemy was ever supposed to attack. She became His Majesty's Hospital Ship Britannic, and she began the work she would do for the rest of her short life, steaming the long sea road between England and the Aegean, carrying the ruined young men of the war back toward home. She was good at it. She was, in truth, magnificent at it, for the very things that would have made her a great liner made her a superb hospital ship. She was huge, so she could carry thousands of casualties in a single voyage. She was fast, so she could make the run in good time. She was steady and strong in a seaway, so the men in her cots suffered less. On her first voyage out, before the year was gone, she sailed for the Greek island of Lemnos and its great harbour at Mudros, and she gathered up thousands of wounded and sick and brought them safely back to Southampton in the first days of the new year. Some 3,000 and more broken men came home in her that first voyage alone, packed into the wards that had been meant for the dining and the dancing of the rich, and the great ship carried them steadily and gently across the winter sea, and set them down on English soil to be mended or to die among their own people. Think for a moment about what she was in those months. This palace turned to mercy. Where there should have been a band playing for men in evening dress, there were now surgeons at their tables. Where there should have been the laughter of a first-class saloon, there were the low sounds of the wounded, the shifting and the murmuring of hundreds of men laid up in rows. The ship that had been the proudest boast of a shipping line had become one of the largest floating hospitals in the world, and she did the work without complaint, out to the Aegean and back, out and back. Each voyage a small triumph of order and care in the middle of a war that seemed to have neither. She was released for a time when the flood of casualties eased, and then recalled when it rose again, and by the autumn of 1916 she was back on the eastern run, steaming the long road toward the islands, as sure of herself as she had ever been. She made further voyages after that, out and back, each one a small triumph of mercy in the middle of a vast and pitiless slaughter. For a time, she was even released from her war duties as the Gallipoli campaign was abandoned and the flood of casualties eased. But the war had more work for her still, and in the autumn of 1916, she was recalled once more to the Eastern Run. Among the many hundreds who served aboard her in those months, wearing the uniforms of the Medical Corps and the Merchant Service, was a young woman whose life reads like something a novelist would be ashamed to invent for being too much. She was a stewardess by trade, a woman of the sea who had spent her working life waiting upon passengers in the cabins of the great liners, and now she served as a nurse aboard the hospital ships. She was slight and dark and composed, and she had about her the particular calm of a person who has already looked at the worst the ocean can do and walked away from it. Twice already the sea had tried to take her, aboard two different ships of this very family of giants, and twice she had lived. Now she had joined the third sister, the Britannic, and she went about her duties in the white-painted wards with no apparent sense of the appointment she was keeping. Her name was Violet Jessop, and before this story is finished, she will have completed the strangest set of survivals in the history of the sea. But her turn is coming. For now, she is only one more figure moving through the corridors of a ship that believes, with every rivet in her armoured hull, that she cannot die. Because that was the mood of her in those last months. The Britannic went about her mercy runs, wrapped in a double confidence. She was a hospital ship, marked and lit and painted, so that no civilized enemy would dare to strike her, protected by the solemn conventions of nations. And she was the unsinkable ship, the answer to the Titanic, the strongest liner ever built, armoured against every death the sea had ever devised. 2 shields, one of law and one of steel, and either one alone should have been enough to keep her safe. But a shield only works against the blow it is made to stop. The shield of law, the red crosses, and the conventions of nations worked against a captain, against a man at a periscope who might choose to spare a marked hospital ship or choose to strike it. A man who could see the crosses and make a decision. It did nothing at all against a mine, which chooses nothing and sees nothing and cannot be appealed to or shamed. And the shield of steel, the double hull and the raised walls worked against the slow flooding of a long, low wound, the death the Titanic had died. It said little against a single upward blast into her belly, and less still against her own open windows. 2 shields, each perfect against a different enemy, and on the morning of the 21st of November, the sea would send an enemy that neither of them had been made to face. A blind iron sphere against the shield of law, and a wound from below against the shield of steel, and the good, decent people aboard opening her windows against both. The Britannic was superbly defended. She was simply defended against the wrong things. The men and women who sailed in her felt those shields around them. On a fine morning in a blue sea, with the red crosses bright on her sides, and the wards swept clean and waiting, it must have seemed impossible that anything could ever bring her down. But the enemy did not read the conventions the way the Britannic's crew did, and there was a weapon loose in the sea that could not be shown a red cross, that could not be reasoned with or warned off or made to see the mercy of a marked ship, because it had no eyes at all. It sat in the dark water, and it waited, and it would strike the first hull that touched it, whether that hull belonged to a battleship or to a floating hospital full of nurses. To understand what happened on the 21st of November, you have to leave the Britannic for a moment and go down into the cold and the quiet where that weapon was waiting, and meet the small grey ship that put it there. Violet Jessop had been aboard the Olympic when a warship tore into her side, and aboard the Titanic when the ice came, and she went to sea again. To sit with that sentence for a moment is to feel the hair rise on the back of the neck, because it is not a legend, and it is not an exaggeration. It is simply the record of one ordinary woman's working life, and that life had placed her 3 separate times at the exact point where this family of great ships met its disasters. She was the thread the sea kept pulling on, and it would pull on her a 3rd time before this story was done. She had been born in Argentina, to Irish parents, and she had come to the sea young, out of need as much as anything, taking work as a stewardess aboard the transatlantic liners when she was barely more than a girl. It was hard work, and not always kind, but she was good at it, calm and capable, and quietly tough, and she rose through it. In 1911, she was serving aboard the eldest of the 3 sisters, the Olympic, the first of the great White Star giants and the pride of the line, when the Olympic, steaming out through the waters near Southampton, was struck on her flank by a Royal Navy cruiser, the Hawke. The warship's ram bow punched a great hole in the liner's side and stove her in badly, and it was only because the Olympic, too, was built with watertight compartments that she stayed afloat and limped back to harbour. Violet Jessop was aboard for all of it, and she survived it without much fuss, and she went on working. It was, she must have thought, the sort of thing that happened perhaps once in a career at sea. A near miss. A story to tell. What is easy to forget, looking back, is that in 1911 the Olympic and her coming sisters were the very symbols of safety. The ships you chose precisely because they were the biggest and the newest and the most heavily subdivided against disaster. To sign on to one of them was to sign on to the safest berth afloat. Violet Jessop was not seeking out danger by serving in these ships. She was doing the opposite. She was working the finest and most modern vessels of her age, the ones the whole world agreed were the least likely ever to come to harm. And that is the quiet horror threaded through her whole story and through the story of the Britannic entire. The ships that were supposed to be the safest were the ones that kept dying, and the woman who kept surviving them was not tempting fate, but simply keeping faith with the promise of the age, the promise that these great giants would look after the people who sailed in them. 3 times that promise would break beneath her feet. 3 times she would climb out of the wreck of it and go back. Then came April of 1912. She had signed on as a stewardess aboard the newest and grandest of the sisters, the Titanic, for that famous maiden voyage. And she was aboard on the night the ship found the ice. She survived that too. She was ordered up and into one of the lifeboats as the great liner settled by the head, and as her boat was being lowered down the towering black side of the dying ship, an officer above her, in the chaos and the cold, reached down and placed a baby into her arms to hold. She kept the child through the freezing night on the open water, and in the grey of the morning, the rescue ship Carpathia came out of the dawn and lifted them all aboard. And Violet Jessop stepped onto her deck, alive, a survivor of the most famous shipwreck in the history of the world. Twice now, the sea had reached for her, aboard 2 ships of the same great family, and twice she had slipped its grip. There is a temptation, looking back at a life like hers, to reach for words like luck or fate or destiny, and the film should resist it, because the truth is stranger and quieter than any of them. Violet Jessop was not marked by the gods. She was a working woman who happened to earn her living aboard the exact ships that the age had built biggest and boldest, and those were the ships the sea kept choosing, and so she kept being there when it chose. The Olympic, the Titanic, the Britannic, 1 family, 3 disasters, and the same small, dark-haired stewardess aboard for each. Not because she was cursed or charmed, but because these were the vessels she served, and these were the vessels that fell. She is the human proof of the whole theme of this story, that the greatest ships, the ones the world was proudest of, were the ones the sea most often took, and that being aboard the safest ship afloat was, again and again, no protection at all. She had learned that lesson twice already. She was about to learn it a 3rd time, in a channel off a Greek island, before the morning was over. Most people, having survived the Titanic, would have found some reason never to set foot on a ship again as long as they lived. Violet Jessop went back. When the war came and the great liners were turned to hospital ships, she volunteered as a nurse, and in the autumn of 1916, she found herself assigned to the 3rd and last of the sisters, the Britannic. She must have felt it, surely, the strangeness of it, the sense of a circle closing. Here was the youngest sister of the 2 ships that had already nearly killed her, and here she was aboard, sailing the war lanes of the Mediterranean, tending the wards. If she was afraid, she left little sign of it. She had a job to do, and she did it. But she had learned things in her 2 brushes with the deep. And one of those things is the small human detail, this whole vast story will come to rest upon at its close. So it is worth planting here, gently, now. On the night the Titanic sank, in the freezing scramble into the boats, Violet Jessop had gone over the side with almost nothing, and in the long, cold days afterward, among all the greater griefs, she had found herself tormented by the lack of one absurdly ordinary thing: a toothbrush. She had had no toothbrush, and the small daily misery of that absence had lodged itself in her memory with a peculiar sharpness. So when she sailed aboard the Britannic, and when the moment came on that November morning to leave her cabin in a hurry, she did one small thing that she had promised herself she would never fail to do again. She went back for her toothbrush. Remember that. A woman who had survived the Olympic and the Titanic, hurrying to leave a third doomed ship, and pausing in the middle of the disaster to snatch up a toothbrush. There is no image in this whole story that says more about how people actually endure the unendurable, and there is no image the sea will treat more cruelly. For now, though, she is simply aboard, one calm, dark presence among the crew of a ship steaming east toward the wounded. She does not know what is waiting in the water ahead. Nobody aboard the Britannic knows. They believe, all of them, that they are sailing in the safest ship afloat, marked and protected, on a mission of mercy that no enemy would dare to strike. They are wrong about that, and they are about to sail into the proof of how wrong, because while the Britannic makes her confident way toward the Aegean, a small grey enemy has already been at work in the narrow channel she must pass through, and it has left something there for her, patient in the dark, that neither her red crosses nor her raised bulkheads nor her double skin of steel can do anything at all to stop. While the Britannic steamed her mercy runs, a small German submarine was sowing death across a narrow Greek channel. This is the crosscut the whole story has been building toward, the moment when the film leaves the bright decks of the great ship and drops down into the cold and the secrecy where her killer was made ready, weeks before she ever came near it. Because the thing that would sink the largest ship in the world was not a sudden stroke of fate on the morning of the 21st of November. It had been lying in wait, silent and armed, since the end of October. The disaster was already in the water. All that remained was for the ship to find it. Her enemy was a vessel called U-73, a mine-laying submarine of the German Navy, operating out of the Mediterranean bases the Central Powers had established for their undersea campaign. She was commanded by a career officer named Gustav C.S., a patient and capable man who understood that the deadliest thing a submarine could do was often not to fire a torpedo at a ship it could see, but to leave a field of mines where ships it would never see were bound one day to pass. A torpedo killed one vessel, the one you aimed at. A minefield killed whatever blundered into it, for as long as the mines stayed moored, and it did the killing while the submarine that laid it was 100 miles away and perfectly safe. It was a cold arithmetic, and CS was good at it, and it was, in its way, the perfect weapon against a ship like the Britannic, though no one on either side would have put it in those terms. The whole of her defence, her double skin and her raised walls and her fleet of boats, assumed an enemy she could see coming and time she could use, the long, slow flooding of a wound that gave her hours. The mine gave her neither. It could not be seen, so her lookouts were useless against it. It struck from below, so her doubled sides, built to resist a blow from the flank, met it at their weakest angle. And it gave no warning at all, so the careful drills and the disciplined crew had only minutes, not hours, to work with. A mine was not merely a danger to the Britannic. It was the precise inversion of everything that made her strong, a death designed, without anyone designing it so, to slip past every single one of her defences at once. CS had laid his field to catch warships and transports. He had, without ever knowing it, laid the one kind of trap that the safest ship in the world was least able to survive. In the last days of October 1916, U-73 came quietly into the Kea Channel. This was the narrow stretch of water between the Greek island of Kea and the mainland, a strait that vessels bound to and from the great naval anchorages of the Aegean had good reason to pass through. It was, in other words, a place where ships would come reliably in the ordinary course of the war. And there, beneath the surface, CS and his crew set to work, laying their cargo of mines. The German records are precise about it. They laid a barrier the Navy numbered as its 32nd minefield, a set of moored contact mines strung across the channel in the dark, each one a sphere of iron packed with explosive, held down to the seabed by a cable and floating at a set depth beneath the waves, waiting. A moored contact mine is a stupid and patient thing. It has no eyes and no judgment. It does not know a battleship from a hospital ship. It knows only one command, which is to detonate the instant a hull touches its horns, and it will hold to that command, faithfully, for as long as its cable holds and its charge stays dry. CS laid his field, and then E-73 turned and slipped away, out of the channel, back toward her distant base for repairs, her work done. She was gone from those waters within days, long before the Britannic ever arrived. This will matter later, when men begin to argue about exactly what struck the great ship, and whether it was a mine at all. The mines she left behind did not stay idle. Within a fortnight, they had already begun to kill. A French vessel, an armed auxiliary steamer pressed into the war, came through the channel in the middle of November and found one of CS's mines with her hull, and she was torn open and sent to the bottom. The barrier had claimed its first ship, and it was not finished. Days after the Britannic's own fate, another British hospital ship would come through the same waters and be badly damaged by the same field of iron. The Kea Channel, that autumn, had quietly become a killing ground, a stretch of pretty blue water with death moored beneath it every few yards, and the ships of the Allies were sailing through it one after another with no idea at all that it had been sown. There is something particularly modern and particularly cold about death by a moored mine, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is the antithesis of everything the Britannic was built to fight. An iceberg can be seen, in time, by a sharp lookout on a clear night. A torpedo leaves a wake, a line of bubbles racing across the surface, a warning of a second or two that a quick helm might yet answer. A mine gives nothing. It hangs beneath the surface, invisible, silent, patient beyond any human patience, and it makes no distinction and offers no chance. It does not aim, and it does not miss. It simply waits for a hull, any hull, to come and touch it, and then it turns a few 100 pounds of explosive into a hammer blow against the thin steel of a ship's bottom, striking upward, from below, in the one direction against which even the strongest liner has the least protection. The men who had armoured the Britannic against the ice had given her a doubled skin along her sides and raised her walls to the sky. Against a blow struck up into her belly from a weapon she could not see and could not dodge, all their genius had, in the end, remarkably little to say. Here is the dreadful shape of it, then, the thing the audience can see, and the crew of the Britannic cannot. On one side, a great white ship steaming east across a sunlit sea, her red crosses bright, her wards swept and waiting, her people confident behind two shields of law and steel. On the other side, deep in a narrow channel she must pass through, a field of blind iron spheres tethered in the dark, already blooded, already proven, waiting with the mindless patience of a machine for the next hull to come. The two are converging. They have been converging for weeks. Every mile the Britannic makes toward the Aegean, brings her closer to the one stretch of water in all that vast sea where her death has been carefully and deliberately prepared. And the terrible thing, the thing that turns this from an accident into something closer to a tragedy in the old sense, is that not one of her defenses addressed this at all. Her designers had armored her against ice and against the slow flooding of a long wound. They had never once drawn a line to protect her against a hammer blow of fire from below, striking upward into her flank in an instant, in the one place and at the one moment she was least prepared to bear it. She could not have known. That is the mercy and the horror of it both. To every soul aboard, the morning ahead was just another leg of a familiar run, a fine, clear dawn in a friendly sea. The mine that would kill them had been in the water for more than 3 weeks. It was waiting now, a few feet beneath the surface, in a channel they would enter with the sun barely up, and nothing, not the red crosses, not the raised bulkheads, not the double hull, not the fleet of boats, not even the strange luck of the woman who had already survived 2 of these ships, could turn the Britannic aside from the water where it lay. All that was left was the sailing of the last few miles, and the floors that the crew themselves, in all innocence and all kindness, were about to leave open for the sea. To keep the wards sweet for wounded men in the Mediterranean heat, the nurses opened the lower portholes and left them open. It is the smallest act imaginable, the turning of a brass wingnut, the swinging back of a heavy glass eye a few inches on its hinge, the letting in of a little sea air on a warm morning. It is the sort of thing a kind person does without a second thought, in a place full of sick men, where the air goes stale and the heat presses down, and a breath of the clean outside is a small mercy you can offer someone who has few enough mercies left. And it is, when the whole terrible sum is finally added up, one of the 2 things that killed the largest ship in the world. Hold that in your mind against everything you have just heard about her defences. The double skin, the bulkheads raised 40 feet, the fleet of boats. All of it, in the end, undone in part by open windows. To understand why, you have to understand where those portholes sat and what they meant to a flooding ship. All along the Britannic's lower decks, below the line of her main strength, ran rows of portholes, round windows set into her hull to give light and air to the spaces within. On a liner carrying passengers, many of these would ordinarily be kept shut and dogged down tight in any kind of weather, because they sat low, close to the water, and an open one was an invitation to the sea. But the Britannic was not carrying passengers. She was carrying, or about to carry, the wounded, and she was working in a hot climate, and the men who ran her wards wanted air moving through those long white rooms. So the portholes on the lower decks were opened, many of them, to ventilate the wards, and they were left open as she steamed against the standing orders that governed such things. On a calm morning in a safe sea, with the ship riding upright and high, an open porthole a few feet above the waterline seemed to threaten nothing at all. But a ship that is filling with water does not ride upright and high. She leans, she settles, she rolls her wounded flank down toward the sea, and when she does, every one of those open portholes that had sat safely above the waterline begins, 1 row at a time, to drop beneath it. And the moment an open porthole goes under, it stops being a window and becomes a wound, a clean round hole in the hull through which the sea pours freely into the very spaces the bulkheads were built to protect, coming in not from below where the engineers had imagined it, but from the side, above the level of their careful calculations, defeating the whole logic of the watertight design from a direction it was never meant to face. The Britannic could float, they had promised, with any 6 of her forward rooms open to the sea. That promise assumed the sea could only get in through the wound the enemy made. It said nothing about the sea getting in through dozens of little brass windows the crew had opened themselves. And here is the part that ought to make anyone pause. The part that turns a technical failure into something like a tragedy in the old and proper sense of the word. Every calculation that had ever been made about the Britannic's survival, every reassuring sum that said she would float with 6 rooms flooded, had been made on the assumption of a ship buttoned up tight, her doors shut, her portholes closed and dogged. That was the ship on the drawing board. It was not the ship that steamed up the Kea Channel on the morning of the 21st of November. The ship that steamed up the channel was a working hospital vessel, with her lower windows open to the warm air and her inner doors ajar for the passage of her crew. And that ship, the real one, the one that actually existed on that morning, had a survival margin that was very much smaller than the one in the calculations, and not a soul aboard her knew it. They believed they were standing on the unsinkable ship. They were standing on something rather less. And the difference between the two was measured in open windows, and the difference between the two was going to be measured, very soon, in minutes and in lives. And the portholes were only half of it. There was a second floor, and it lived deep in the heart of her, among the great steel doors that were meant to be her salvation. Running through the lower body of the ship, at the base of every watertight bulkhead, were heavy sliding doors that could be closed to seal one compartment off from the next, either by the men working there or, in an emergency, by a single throw of a lever on the bridge. Closed, they made the ship the honeycomb of sealed cells her designers intended. Open, they made a mockery of the whole system, because water that got into one room could walk straight through an open door into the next. And on a working ship, on an ordinary morning, not all of those doors stood ready to close. Some were open for the passage of men and coal and gear, and the fatal timing of what was coming would catch several of them open at exactly the wrong moment, when the watches were changing and the boiler room crews were moving about, so that the doors that should have sealed the wound off in an instant would instead stand gaping and let the flooding run aft through the belly of the ship faster than any pump could fight it. This is the terrible engine of dramatic irony, running now at full pressure beneath the calm surface of the story. The audience can see both floors laid bare, the open portholes waiting along the lower decks, the doors that will not all be shut in time, and the crew can see neither, because to them these are not floors at all. They are the ordinary conditions of a safe ship going about safe work. The nurse opening a porthole is being kind. The stoker leaving a door open is being practical. The captain, when his turn comes, will make his bold run for the island out of pure sound judgment. Not one of them is doing anything wrong, by any measure they could apply on that bright morning. And that is the deepest cruelty in the whole account, deeper than the mine, deeper than the war. The Britannic was not brought down by negligence or by villainy. She was brought down, in part, by decency and routine, by good people doing ordinary things aboard a ship they had every reason to believe could not be killed. All the pieces are on the board now. The blind mine waiting in the channel, the open windows along her flank, the doors that will stand ajar at the change of the watch, the great ship confident behind her shields. Everything is set. All that remains is for the Britannic to sail the last few miles into the trap, on a morning so fine and so ordinary that the men who lived through it would remember, above all, how peaceful it had been, right up to the instant the sea broke in half. On the morning of the 21st of November, 1916, she came up the Kea Channel empty, running fast toward the wounded she meant to save. That word, empty, is the hinge on which the whole death toll of this story turns, so let it land properly. She was outbound. She was steaming east, away from England, toward the Aegean anchorages where she would take on her cargo of broken men. She had not yet reached them. Her long white wards, all those rows of iron cots, stood swept and made up and utterly empty, waiting for patients she had not yet collected. Aboard her that morning, there were no wounded at all, only the people who ran and served the ship, her crew and her doctors and her nurses and her orderlies, something in the order of 1,066 souls all told by the counting of her captain. Remember that she was empty. When you learn, at the end, how few died, you will understand that the reason is written here, in this one plain fact, that on the morning the trap closed, the beds of the hospital ship were bare. It is worth saying plainly what an outbound voyage meant, because it changes the whole moral weight of what is coming. This was not one of her homeward runs, heavy with the wounded, her lower decks a floating ward of men who could not move. This was the empty leg, the run out to fetch them, and so the only people aboard were the ones fit and able to help themselves, the crew who knew the ship and the medical staff who could climb a ladder and pull an oar and swim. If the sea had to choose a morning to spring its trap, it could hardly have chosen one on which the Britannic was better placed to save her own people. That single accident of timing, empty rather than full, outbound rather than home, is the difference between the story you are hearing, a great ship lost with 30 dead, and a story too terrible to tell. The trap was the same. The mine was the same. Only the beds were empty, and the emptiness of those beds is the thinnest and most fragile mercy in this whole account. The morning itself was beautiful, and every survivor who ever spoke of it said so. It was clear and fine and calm, the Aegean at its gentlest, the light coming up golden over the brown hills of the islands, the sea flat and easy under the bow. Breakfast was being served. The night watches were handing over to the morning watches, that daily changing of the guard when men come up sleepy from below and others go down to take their places, when doors stand open for the passing of bodies and the ship is, for a little while, in the middle of her own quiet routine. Down in the wards, the nurses moved about their preparations, and along the lower decks, the portholes stood open to the sweet morning air. On the bridge, high above the water, the officers held her steady on her course up the channel, the same channel her sisters in mercy had used before her, a familiar road in a friendly sea. There was coffee and the murmur of an ordinary morning, and the great engines turning far below, driving 48,000 tons of ship smoothly through the calm. It is worth holding this scene still for a moment, this last ordinary moment, because everyone in it was about to be changed forever, and not one of them knew it. Somewhere in the wards, a nurse straightened a blanket on an empty cot. Somewhere below, a stoker fed a furnace and wiped the sweat from his face and thought about his breakfast. Somewhere along a lower deck, a hand reached out and swung a porthole open another inch to catch the morning air. On the bridge, an officer noted the ship's position and her speed and the fine, clear weather in the log. All of it perfectly ordinary. All of it the small, unremarkable business of a great ship going about a routine passage on a beautiful day, and all of it happening in the last few minutes before the sea came up through the bottom of the world, so that every one of these people would carry the memory of this quiet morning for the rest of their lives as the thing that came just before. The peace of it was real. That is what the survivors remembered most in the years afterward, how peaceful it had been. Right up until it was not. Her master stood among the certainties of that morning, a seaman of long experience named Charles Bartlett. He had spent his life at sea, and he had a reputation for caution, for a careful eye and a sound judgment, the very qualities you would want in the man responsible for the safest ship afloat. There was, that morning, Nothing that seemed to call for anything more than the ordinary vigilance of a captain on a routine passage. The war felt distant. The sea was empty and calm. The ship was strong and marked and protected. If Bartlett felt any unease as the brown shoulders of Kea slid by off the beam, no record of it survives, and there is no reason he should have. He had come this way before. His sister ships in Mercy had come this way before. The channel was a road, and roads are safe until the day they are not, and there was nothing in the fine, clear morning to tell him that this particular passage of this particular strait on this particular day was the one his whole careful life at sea had been leading him toward. He was doing what he had done many times before, bringing a great ship up a known channel on a fine morning toward a job of mercy at the far end of it. And all the while, a few feet beneath that calm, bright surface, the mine waited. It had been there for more than 3 weeks. It had already killed one ship, and it would kill another after this. It hung on its cable in the green water directly in the path of the great white hull, now bearing down upon it at better than 20 knots. And it felt nothing, and it knew nothing, and it simply waited for the touch that would set it off. There is a horror in slow convergence that no sudden accident can match. The horror of watching two things move toward each other that cannot be warned or turned aside. Of knowing the exact geometry of a disaster, while the people inside it sip their coffee and speak of ordinary things. The Britannic was steaming at 20 knots into the one patch of that whole vast sea where her death had been carefully prepared and left to ripen. Every turn of her propellers carried her nearer. The distance closed to a mile, and then to half a mile, and then to a few hundred yards, and the officers on the bridge saw nothing but blue water and the fine, clear morning, and below the surface the iron sphere hung waiting on its cable, and the great bow came on. At 12 minutes past 8, the two of them met. At 12 minutes past 8, a wall of noise and water rose against her starboard bow, and the morning broke in half. There was no warning, and there could not have been. A moored mine gives none. One instant, the Britannic was steaming smoothly through the calm, and the next, there was a single vast concussion far forward on her right-hand side, a blow that came up out of the sea and struck her below the waterline with the force of a great hammer swung against the hull of the world. Men felt it before they understood it, felt the whole ship shudder and quiver from her bow to her stern, felt the deck jump beneath their feet, felt in their chests the deep, sick thud of it. And then, an instant later, the sound reached them, the enormous flat roar of the explosion rolling up through the steel. Consider that single instant from the many places it was lived, because this is the moment the whole film has been withholding, and it deserves to be seen through more than one pair of eyes. On the bridge, high and far aft of the blow, the officers felt the shock come up through the ship and saw forward the first ugly sign of it, and in the space of a breath, the calm routine of the morning was gone, and something cold and urgent had taken its place. Deep down in the forward part of the ship, near where the mine had struck, men in the boiler rooms and the working spaces felt the full raw violence of it, the lights failing, the roar, the first appalling inrush of the sea, where a moment before there had been only steel and the ordinary noise of the engines. In the wards and the cabins along the upper decks, nurses and orderlies and off-duty crew felt the great jolt run through the ship and looked at one another, that first frozen instant of not yet knowing. Is this serious? Is this bad? Is this the thing they had all been told could never happen? And somewhere among them, Violet Jessop felt it too. This woman who had felt the Hawk tear into the Olympic and felt the Titanic strike the ice, and who now, for the third time in her life, felt one of these great sisters take a mortal wound beneath her feet. For a few seconds after the blast, there was that strange, suspended silence that comes in the wake of a great shock. The moment before the mind catches up with the body, before people begin to move and to call out. And then the ship answered for herself, and there was no more doubt. She took on her list toward the wounded side at once, leaning her starboard rail down toward the sea, and her head began to go down, gently at first, and then not gently, so that the decks that had been level a moment before now tilted underfoot, and cups slid from tables, and loose things began to move. And every person aboard understood in the same instant, in the animal part of themselves that needs no telling, that something enormous and terrible had happened to the ship beneath them, and that it was not going to stop. The Britannic was down by the head and leaning hard within a minute of the blow. There was no slow grace to it, no long, uncertain settling. From almost the first breath, she was a ship in a hurry to die. The blow had landed forward on the starboard side, low in the region where two of her great holds met near the front of the ship. It was a concentrated, violent, upward stroke, and it did in an instant what the Titanic's iceberg had taken a long, slow scrape to do. It opened her to the sea across a critical join in her body. Water, the enemy her whole design existed to fight, came pouring in through the torn plating, cold and black and irresistible, filling the forward spaces and beginning, at once, to drag her head down toward it. From the very first minute, she was going down by the bow, and she was taking on a lean toward the wounded starboard side. And the men who understood ships understood, quickly, that this was not a scratch. This was the thing the world had promised could not happen to her. This was a giant, mortally struck in the first minute of her dying. Down in the working spaces near the wound, the men who survived those first seconds carried the memory of them for the rest of their lives, and it was a memory of chaos beyond describing. The lights failing and the emergency lamps swinging. The roar of the sea coming in where a wall of steel had been. The floor tilting under their feet as the ship began her lean, so that a man's whole world went suddenly out of true. Some were killed outright by the blast. Others scrambled up ladders and through hatches ahead of the rising water, coming out onto the decks, stunned and soaked and half-deafened, into the strange, bright calm of the morning above, where the sea was flat and the sun was warm and the island lay green on the horizon. And the only sign that anything was wrong was the growing tilt of the deck and the low, urgent movement of the crew. That was the particular strangeness of the Britannic's death, that it began in violence and darkness below, and yet was lived out, for most of those aboard, in daylight and quiet. A disaster unfolding on a perfect morning, which somehow made it harder rather than easier to believe. But here is where the promise still had a chance to hold, and where the tension of these next minutes truly lives. Because a mortal wound to the Britannic was not supposed to be a death sentence. This was precisely the case her designers had built her for. She was meant to take a great forward wound and to flood her forward compartments and to sit there, down by the head, leaning, hurt but alive, held up by all those raised bulkheads and sealed cells, floating in defiance of the sea while help came racing to her. On the bridge, Captain Bartlett, that careful and experienced man, moved at once to make her defences work as they were meant to. He called for the watertight doors to be closed, to seal the wound off and pen the flooding into the forward rooms where it could do no more harm. He ordered the call for help sent out across the morning air, the signal that a great ship was in distress in the Kea Channel and needed every hull that could hear it to come. He did, in those first minutes, everything a master could do, everything the design assumed he would do. If the ship performed as she had been built to perform, She would live. The clock was running now, and it would not stop. 12 minutes past 8, and counting. Somewhere below, the sea was climbing through the forward compartments. Somewhere on the bridge, a lever was thrown to close the great doors and pen it in. And somewhere in the machinery of the ship, in the honeycomb of steel cells that were her whole promise of survival, one of those doors was about to refuse the order it was given and let the water walk aft into a room it should never have reached. The Britannic had been struck, and struck hard, but she was not yet doomed. What doomed her was about to happen out of sight, in the dark and the noise below the waterline, in the failing of a single door. Captain Bartlett called for the watertight doors, and deep in the ship, one of them refused him. This is the hinge of the entire disaster, the precise point at which a survivable wound became a fatal one. And it happened where no one on the bridge could see it, among the boilers, in the roar and the rising water, at the base of one of the great steel bulkheads. When Bartlett threw the switch to seal her up, most of the doors obeyed, sliding down into their frames as they were built to do, walling off compartment from compartment. But between two of the forward boiler rooms, the 6th and the 5th counting back from the bow, a door failed to close properly. Whether the blast of the mine had buckled its frame just enough to jam it, or whether the terrible timing of the change of watch had caught it open and blocked, the accounts differ. What is not in doubt is the consequence. That door did not seal, and through the gap it left, the sea, which should have been penned forever in the forward rooms, found a road aft. Understand what that meant against everything she had been built to be. The Britannic's survival rested on a single elegant promise that the water could be trapped, that no matter how badly her bow was opened, the flooding could be sealed into her forward compartments and held there, and that she could float on the buoyancy of all the sealed rooms behind. 6 flooded compartments, the calculation ran, and still she would swim. That promise depended utterly on the walls holding and the doors closing. It was a promise made entirely of sealed steel, and a promise made of sealed steel is only as good as the man or the mechanism that seals it, in the half-second when it counts. That is the brutal lesson buried in that failed door. All the engineering in the world, all the raised bulkheads and doubled hulls, came down in the end to weather one particular door, deep in the ship, in the dark, in the noise, at the change of a watch, slid home into its frame when the lever was thrown. It did not. And because it did not, 40 years of progress in shipbuilding, all the hard-learned lessons of the Titanic, all the grief poured into steel, were undone by a gap a few feet wide in a boiler room no passenger would ever see. There is no drama in it, no villain, no moment of high tragedy. There is only a door that should have closed and did not, and a sea that walked through the space where it should have been, and a great ship dying because of it. The largest things are so often undone by the smallest. And now, in the very first minutes, one door in that chain of defences stood open, and the sea was walking through it, out of the forward rooms where it belonged, back into boiler room 5, and looking already for the next room beyond that. The honeycomb was breached from within. The elegant promise was failing, quietly, in the dark, while the men on the bridge still believed she might yet be saved. There is a comparison that makes the failure vivid, and it is the comparison the whole film has been holding in reserve, because it is the same ship, dying a different way. When the Titanic met her iceberg, the ice opened her along a long, low seam and let the sea into a string of her forward compartments, and her short bulkheads let the water climb from one room to the next over hours, and she went down slowly by the head, in the dark, over 2 hours and 40 minutes. The Britannic was supposed to have fixed every part of that. Her bulkheads were higher, Her margin was greater, and yet here she was, taking on water faster than the Titanic ever had, from a wound that was larger and lower and more violent, spreading through a door that would not close, so that the very improvements meant to make her slower to die were being outrun by the sheer speed and size of the flooding. The stronger ship was sinking faster than the weaker one. Everything about that should have been impossible. It was happening anyway, minute by minute, while the calm, bright morning held its breath. And it was worse than a single door, because the wound itself was proving larger and lower and more forward than her design had ever truly reckoned with. And the flooding was fast, far faster than the slow, gentle filling that had taken the Titanic. The sea did not creep into the Britannic. It rushed. It came in through the torn plating in a torrent, and it ran aft through the failed door, and it began, ominously, to reach toward the very number of compartments beyond which no calculation could save her. She had been built to float with 6 rooms flooded. The mine and the open door and the sheer violence of the ingress were conspiring to give her more than 6, and to give them to her in minutes rather than hours. The margin that had made her the safest ship in the world was being eaten away in front of the men who trusted it, and there was nothing they could do to close that jammed door far below, in the flooding dark, in the roar. There is a particular kind of dread in watching a safeguard fail, worse than the dread of having no safeguard at all. The people aboard the Britannic were not passengers on a doomed and defenseless ship. They were passengers on the ship that could not be doomed, and they had been told so, and they believed it. And now, in the first minutes after the blast, that belief was quietly dying beneath their feet without their knowing it. On the upper decks, the mood was not yet panic. It was closer to a tense, disciplined readiness, the crew moving to their stations, the boats being swung out on those great gantry davits, the whole apparatus of a well-drilled ship responding to an emergency it had trained for. They were doing everything right. And all the while, below them, in a boiler room they would never see, the sea was pouring through a door that would not shut, and the ship they stood upon was passing, minute by minute, out of the realm of the survivable and into the realm of the certainly lost. Bartlett, on the bridge, was a good enough seaman to read the ship beneath his feet, and what he read was growing worse by the moment. She was going down by the head faster than she should. She was leaning further to starboard than she should. The reports coming up from below, when they could come at all, spoke of flooding spreading where it was not supposed to spread. He was a careful man, and he could see, with a cold clarity, that the promise was failing, that the doors and the walls were not going to hold this wound, that the safest ship afloat was, against every calculation, going to sink. And so this careful man, standing on the bridge of a dying giant with more than 1,000 lives in his hands and the clock running hard, reached for the one desperate hope the geography of that morning still offered him. Off the starboard bow, only 3 miles distant across the calm, bright water, lay the brown hills of the island of Kea. If he could not keep her afloat, perhaps he could still run her aground before she went, drive her up onto the shallows of that island and beach her there, and turn a sinking into a stranding and save every soul aboard. It was a bold thought, and a sound one, and in the reaching for it lay the final, terrible acceleration of her death. 3 miles off the starboard bow lay the brown hills of Kea, and Bartlett made the only choice a captain could. He would run for the island. He would drive his wounded ship toward those shallows with everything her engines still had, and try to put her aground before the sea could put her under, and so save the more than 1,000 people aboard her by trading a sinking for a stranding. On the face of it, it was the right decision. Perhaps the only decision, the kind of clear-headed gamble that a careful and experienced master makes when the careful and unhurried options have all been taken from him. Held still and left to founder in the deep water of the Channel, the Britannic would take her people down with her into 400 feet of sea. Driven up onto Kea, she might sit there in the shallows, ruined but stable, every soul walked ashore. Bartlett gave the order, turn her toward the island, drive her on. To be fair to the man, weigh what he was holding in that moment. He had more than 1,000 lives beneath his feet, and a ship that was flooding faster than any calculation had allowed for. He had, off his bow, an island close enough to reach if he moved at once, and beneath him, a channel deep enough to swallow the ship whole if he did not. He had minutes, perhaps, to decide, with the deck tilting and the reports from below growing worse by the second. And he chose the bold thing, the active thing, the thing that gave his people the best chance, as he understood it, to run her aground and turn a certain sinking into a possible stranding. It is exactly the choice you would want a captain to make, decisive and brave and grounded in good seamanship. He could not have known that the very state of his ship, the open windows he could not see, had turned the bold choice into the fatal one. He was playing the hand well. He simply did not know that the deck had been stacked against him weeks before by a submarine he never saw, and that very morning by the kindness of his own nurses. And in that order, sound as it was, lay the mechanism that would kill her faster than the mine ever could alone. Because the Britannic was not steaming through open sea now. She was down by the head, leaning to starboard, hold forward, with rows of open portholes running along her lower flanks. And when Bartlett drove her forward, hard, toward the island, he drove that wounded, leaning bow deeper into the water and pushed a great pressure of sea against her opened front. Every yard of speed she made forced more water through the torn plating, and worse, drove those open lower portholes down beneath the surface faster and deeper than her mere settling would have done. One row of little brass windows after another went under as she plunged ahead, and each one, the moment it submerged, became another open mouth swallowing the sea, pouring it into the wards and the lower decks in torrents, filling her from the side even as she flooded from the front. The very act of racing for salvation was opening every door in her body to the water. She was drowning herself in her own forward rush. No one aboard could have known this in the moment, and that is what saves Bartlett's decision from any charge of blame. He could not see the open portholes going under along the lower decks. He could not watch the sea pouring in through row after row of little brass windows as his ship drove forward. He could only see the island ahead, and the clock running, and the plain hard fact that a ship left to founder in deep water takes her people down with her, while a ship put aground might set them all safely ashore. By every rule of the sea he knew, running for Kea was the right and even the brave choice. And had the Britannic been buttoned up tight the way the calculations assumed, it might even have worked. It was the hidden flaw, the open windows he could not see, that turned his rescue into an accelerant. He was trying to save her, and the state of the ship turned his saving into a killing. That is the shape of this whole disaster in miniature. Good decisions made by capable people, each one sound on its own, combining in the dark into something none of them intended and none of them could stop. This is the bitter heart of the whole story, the paradox the film was built to deliver, and it is happening now in real time on that bright, calm morning. The safest ship ever built, struck by a wound she was designed to survive, was being driven under, not by the failure of her strength, but by the sum of small things her own people had done in kindness and good sense. The open portholes, thrown wide for the comfort of the wounded. the doors ajar at the change of the watch, the captain's brave and correct decision to run for the island, which drove those open portholes beneath the sea. Each choice defensible, each choice made by a competent person acting well. And together, they were tipping 48,000 tons of the finest steel afloat toward the bottom of the Kea Channel in a fraction of the time her design had promised. She could not stop it. Bartlett could not stop it. The lean grew steeper. The bow went deeper. The water climbed the decks. And now the geography of that shallow channel added its own cruelty. The Kea Channel was not deep everywhere, and the Britannic was very long, longer than the water beneath her in places was deep. As her bow went down and down, driven on toward the island, there came a point where the front of her began to reach toward the seabed, while the rest of her still lay on the surface, so that the great ship was not simply settling evenly into the sea, but pitching forward, her stern beginning to rise as her bow found the bottom. This is a thing that happens to very large ships dying in water, not much deeper than they are long, and it is a terrible thing, because as the bow grounds and the stern lifts, the after end of the ship comes up and up out of the water, and everything mounted at that after end, everything that was built to drive her through the sea, comes up with it, rising into the air, still turning. On the decks, the evacuation was underway in earnest now, and it was, by the standard of such things, going remarkably well. The morning was calm and bright, not the freezing midnight chaos of the Titanic. The ship was close to land, and help was already racing toward her across the water. The great gantry davits, the crane-like arms that were her designer's proudest answer to the Titanic's failure, were swinging out the boats and lowering them full of people toward the sea. The crew were disciplined, the nurses steady, the loading orderly. In almost every way, the Britannic in her dying was doing exactly what she had been built to do in the way of getting her people off her. Boats were going down her side loaded with crew and medical staff, pulling away across the calm blue water towards safety. It should have been a triumph of the very design the Titanic's death had forced into being, the great ship going down, but her people, all of them, coming off alive. But the stern was rising, and beneath that rising stern, still turning, still driven by engines that had not yet been stopped, the enormous propellers were coming up out of the sea, and two of the boats, loaded with people, lowered too soon or drifting in the wrong direction, were being drawn, slowly and then not slowly, toward the place where those great bronze blades were rising into the air and chopping down through the water they had not yet left. The one horror this film planted in its very first minute, the withheld image, the thing hinted at and held back, was about to happen, in daylight, in front of everyone. The boats were drifting toward the blades. As the stern rose, the great port propeller came clear of the water, still turning, and two boats full of people drifted toward it. There is no gentle way to tell what happened next, and the film should not try to find one, because the truth of it is the emotional peak of the whole story, and it must be met head-on. The Britannic's stern had lifted as her bow drove down toward the seabed, and her huge propellers, each one a wheel of solid bronze taller than a house, were rising out of the sea into the morning air while the engines still turned them. And two of her lifeboats, crowded with living people, some of them lowered without orders in the urgency of the moment, had been carried by the ship's own forward motion and the swirl of the water back toward the stern, back toward the rising blades. The people in those boats could see what was coming. There was almost nothing they could do about it. The boats were drawn into the arc of the turning propeller, and in a few seconds the blades came down through them and destroyed them, and the people in them, utterly. It was over in the space of a breath. The great bronze wheel, turning in the air and the shallow water, took the two boats and shattered them to splinters, and took the lives in them with the same indifferent motion. And the calm, bright water, where they had been, was suddenly a churn of wreckage. Nearly every soul who died on the Britannic that morning died in those two boats, in those few seconds, cut down not by the mine and not by the sea, but by the ship's own propellers rising out of the water as she pitched forward toward the island. It is the cruelest fact in the whole account. Of all the more than 1,000 people aboard, the ones who died were, almost everyone, the ones who had already made it off the ship and into the boats. The ones who thought they were saved, gathered together in the two small craft that drifted into the blades. The safest ship in the world killed her own dead with the very machinery that was meant to carry her to safety. It is the detail that stays with people longest once they have heard this story, longer even than the paradox of the 55 minutes, because it is so terribly close to a happy ending, and then it is not. These were not people trapped below and drowned. These were people who had done everything right, who had reached the boats, who were away and clear and rowing toward an island in a calm, bright sea, who by every reasonable measure were already saved. And then the ship's own stern rose behind them, and the great bronze wheels came up, turning, and took them. To survive the mine, and the flooding, and the scramble for the boats, and the lowering down the towering side, and to die at the last in the churn of the propellers, with the danger apparently behind you, is a cruelty of a very particular kind. The sea did not even do it. The ship did it to her own. And that, more than the mine, is the image the Britannic leaves in the mind. A great ship pitching forward toward salvation and killing the saved with the last turn of her engines. And here, at the very centre of the horror, the thread the sea had been pulling on all this, while comes taut for the last time. Violet Jessop, the woman who had survived the Olympic and the Titanic, was in one of the boats drawn toward the propellers. She saw the blades rising. She understood, with the terrible clarity of a woman who had already looked at death twice, what was about to happen to the little craft she sat in. And she did the only thing left to do. She threw herself out of the boat and into the sea, and went down into the water to get away from the surface where the blades were coming. And as she went under, she was struck a savage blow to the head, her skull fractured by the impact. Whether against the ship's keel or the boat or the churn of the wreck, no one could ever say for certain. By her own account, in later years, she believed she owed her life to the thickness of her own hair, which cushioned the blow just enough to keep it from killing her. She came up out of the water alive, injured and bleeding and half senseless, but alive, for the third time in her charmed and terrible life, pulled living from the wreck of one of these great sisters. Somewhere in the chaos of that morning, she still had her toothbrush. Try to hold the whole scene in a single frame, the way the people who lived it never could, because they each saw only their own small corner of it. The great ship pitched forward, her stern high in the air, her wounded flank rolling down toward the sea. Along her decks, the last of her people going into the boats and down her side. Out on the calm water, boats already pulling away, full of nurses and orderlies and crew, some of them cheering, some of them weeping, most of them simply rowing hard to be clear of the dying giant. And back beneath the rising stern, the two doomed boats drifting the wrong way, toward the place where the enormous bronze wheels were coming up out of the water, still turning, and the people in them beginning to understand, in the last seconds, exactly where the current and the ship's own motion were carrying them. It is the multi-eyed instant of the whole disaster. One moment lived 1,000 ways, and at its dark centre the two boats and the blades. There was no villain in it. There was only physics and bad luck. and the terrible machinery of a great ship dying in shallow water, and 30 people who had almost made it. On the bridge, Bartlett saw the horror at the stern and understood at once what his forward rush had done, and he gave the order to stop the engines. But an order to stop the engines of a great ship does not stop them in an instant. There is way on her still, momentum in all that turning steel, and by the time the propellers ground to a halt, the boats were already gone, and the people in them already dead. It is one of the smallest and most agonizing margins in the whole story. The few seconds between the captain seeing and the blades stopping, seconds in which the ship killed the very people her design had just finished saving. Bartlett stopped the engines. The stern settled back, and the evacuation, chastened and horrified, went on. The remaining boats pulling away clear of the deadly stern now, out across the water, carrying the great majority who would live. Now the ticking clock ran down to its last minutes. The Britannic was finished, and everyone could see it. Her bow was deep in the sea, grounding toward the bottom of the channel, her stern high, her lean growing ever steeper as she rolled onto her wounded starboard side. Around 8:35, only some 20-odd minutes after the mine had struck, the order to abandon her went out in full, and the last of her people went over the side and into the boats and the water. Bartlett stayed with her to the end, as a captain does, up on the tilting bridge as the sea came up the decks toward him. And when there was nothing more to be done, he walked off the drowning bridge and into the water and swam to a boat. And the great ship, the largest in the world, the answer to the Titanic, the unsinkable third sister, rolled slowly over onto her starboard side, her stern lifting one last time into the bright morning air, and slid down into the Kea Channel. It was about 7 minutes past 9. The mine had struck at 12 minutes past 8. She had lived, from the blow to the end, for 55 minutes. The disaster she had been built to prevent, the sinking of the Titanic, had taken 2 hours and 40. The safer ship, the stronger ship, the ship rebuilt from grief to be beyond the reach of the sea, had died in barely a third of the time. The water closed over the place where she had been, and the morning went quiet, and 1,066 people, minus the 30. The blades had taken, floated in the calm blue channel, and waited to be saved. The first help to reach the survivors came not from the fleet, but from a handful of fishermen in a wooden boat. This is one of the small mercies of the Britannic's story, set against the enormity of the rest. And it deserves its moment, because after all the violence of the morning, the sea gave these people something the Titanic's people never had. It gave them a calm, bright day, close to land, in waters where help was near. The men and women who had come off the great ship were not scattered across a freezing midnight ocean hundreds of miles from any shore. They were floating in a mild blue channel under a morning sun, within sight of an island, and rescue was coming quickly. The local fishermen of Kea, seeing the disaster unfold in their own home waters, put out at once in their small craft, their kayaks, and began pulling survivors from the sea and the boats. Ordinary Greek fishermen hauling exhausted nurses and stokers and orderlies over the gunwales of their fishing boats, the first hands of salvation to reach the wreck of the largest ship in the world. It is worth pausing on the mercy of the setting, because everything about it stood in exact opposition to the night the Titanic died, and the contrast is the reason so many lived. The Titanic had gone down at the very edge of midnight, in the black of a moonless night, in water so cold it killed a strong man in minutes, hundreds of miles from any shore, with the nearest ship hours away. The Britannic went down in the full light of a fine morning, in the mild water of a Greek channel in a sea that was warm even in November, within 3 miles of an inhabited island, with warships close enough to hear her call and reach her within the hour. The people in her boats and in her water were not fighting the cold and the dark and the distance and the loneliness. They were floating in a bright, calm sea under a friendly sun, with land in sight and help already racing toward them. Almost everything that had made the Titanic's night a slaughter was, on the Britannic's morning, reversed. And so, apart from the one grotesque accident of the propellers, almost everyone came home. Behind them came the Navy, fast. The Britannic's call for help had gone out across the morning air in those first frantic minutes, and the warships of the Allied fleet in those waters had heard it and come running. A destroyer reached the scene and stopped and began taking survivors aboard by the hundred. An armed boarding steamer arrived and did the same, lifting hundreds more out of the boats and the water. Later, another warship came up and swept the area and anchored off the little port on Kea to give what medical help she could and to gather in the last of the survivors. Between the fishermen and the warships, the people of the Britannic were pulled from the channel with a speed and a thoroughness that the freezing chaos of the Titanic had never allowed. Some of them had made their own way to the island, and there, in the little harbour of the Greek village, the surviving doctors and nurses of the hospital ship, wounded and soaked and exhausted as they were, set about doing the work they had trained for, tending the injured on the quayside, tearing up their own aprons and pieces of lifebelts to make dressings. A hospital ship's medical staff improvising a hospital on a foreign shore out of the wreck of their own vessel. There is a quiet heroism in that scene that deserves its moment, for these were people who had just lived through the sinking of the largest ship in the world, who were soaked and battered, and some of them badly hurt, and who turned at once, on a strange quay in a foreign country, to the work of caring for the others. The nurses of the Britannic had been carried aboard to tend the wounded of a war, and they never reached the wounded they had sailed to fetch, and instead they found themselves tending the wounded of their own disaster on the stones of a Greek harbour, with nothing but what they could tear from their own clothing. It is exactly the kind of thing that does not make the headlines of a great sinking, the ordinary decency that carries on in the wreckage. And it is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to remember. The ship was gone. The people she carried went on being who they were. And when it was all counted, the toll was astonishing. Not for how large it was, but for how small. Of the more than 1,000 people who had sailed aboard the Britannic that morning, 30 had died. 30. Out of 1,066 souls, 1,036 were saved. For a disaster of this size, the sinking of the largest ship in the world, the loss of only 30 lives is a figure so low it seems almost impossible. And the contrast with her famous sister is stark beyond words. The Titanic had taken more than 1,500 people down with her. The Britannic, a larger ship sunk in a third of the time, took 30. Put those two numbers side by side and let the strangeness of them sit, because they seem to make no sense at all. The larger ship, sunk faster, cost fewer than 1 in 50 of the lives the smaller and slower disaster had. Everything about the raw shape of the two events says the Britannic should have been the greater slaughter, sinking in a third of the time, a bigger vessel, a more violent wound. And instead she was, in terms of lives lost, one of the gentlest great sinkings in the history of the sea. The whole difference lies in the things that surrounded the disaster rather than the disaster itself: the daylight instead of the dark, the warm channel instead of the freezing Atlantic, the near island instead of the empty ocean, the fast rescue instead of the long, lonely wait, and above all, the empty beds instead of the full ones. The ship's death was worse. The circumstances of it were kinder. And 30 people paid with their lives for the one circumstance that was not kind at all: the rising stern, and the turning blades. It is one of the strangest and most merciful facts in the whole history of the sea, and to understand why the number was so small is to arrive at the most chilling truth in this entire story. The truth that the disaster you have just watched was not the disaster it might have been, and that the Britannic, in dying almost empty on a calm, bright morning, escaped a horror that would have dwarfed the Titanic and everything else. Because those 30 who died did not, almost any of them, die inside the ship or in the water or for want of a boat. They died in the 2 lifeboats that drifted into the propellers, cut down in seconds by the ship's own blades at the very moment of the rising stern. Take away that single terrible event, and the Britannic disaster would have cost almost no lives at all. The evacuation, apart from the propellers, had worked. The boats had launched, the people had come off, the calm sea and the near land, and the fast rescue had done the rest. The great majority who lived owed their lives to the very things the Titanic had lacked: the daylight, the calm, the closeness of shore, the boats and the cranes to launch them. The 30 who died owed their deaths to the one grotesque accident of the rising stern and the turning blades. And the reason the total was 30 and not 3,000 lay in a single fact established long before the mine ever struck. The fact that on that particular morning, the wards of the hospital ship were empty. To see what the Britannic escaped, you have to imagine the morning she so narrowly missed. Only 30 people died, and the reason is the most chilling fact in the whole story. She was empty. She was outbound, steaming east to collect her cargo of wounded, and she had not yet reached them. And so the long white wards that ran the length of her lower decks, all those iron cots in their disciplined rows, stood swept and made up and utterly bare. There were no patients aboard. And now set that fact beside the mechanism of her death, and feel the horror of what did not happen. She was killed, in large part, by the flooding of her lower decks through the open portholes, the same lower decks where, on any homeward voyage, thousands of wounded men would have been lying helpless in their beds. On the morning she actually sank, those decks held only empty cots and the rushing sea. On a homeward morning, they would have held a floating hospital full of men who could not walk, could not climb, could not swim, many of them unable even to rise from their beds without help, packed into the very compartments that filled first and fastest with the sea. Turn it over slowly, because the film should let the audience sit with it. A ship that sank in 55 minutes. A stern that rose and killed 2 boatloads of the fit and the able, even as they pulled away. Lower decks that flooded through their own open windows in a matter of minutes. Now fill those lower decks with 3,000 stretcher cases, men with shattered legs and fevered bodies and amputated limbs. Men who needed to be carried up steep stairways and lifted into boats one at a time, and give the whole scene 55 minutes and a rising, killing stern, and you have not a disaster with 30 dead. You have a catastrophe that could have rivaled or exceeded anything in the history of the sea, a loss of life on a scale to make the Titanic itself a smaller sorrow. And it is not an idle nightmare, this imagining, because the Britannic really did carry thousands of wounded on her homeward legs, really did pack those lower decks with helpless men, really did make that same passage through those same waters loaded to the gunwales with the broken. Had the mine found her 3 days later, or on the return leg of that very voyage, she would have been steaming home full. The only thing that stood between the Britannic and a place at the very top of the grim ledger of maritime disaster was the direction she happened to be pointing on the morning she died. Outbound, empty, 30 dead. Homebound, full, and the number does not bear thinking about. Fate did not spare her. It spared the men who were not yet aboard her, the thousands of wounded still waiting in the hospitals of the Aegean for a ship that would now never come to collect them. They never knew how close they came to a grave in the Kea Channel. They never knew that their beds on that particular morning were empty, and that the emptiness of those beds is the only reason this story is remembered as a near miracle of survival, rather than as the worst thing that ever happened at sea. That is the morning the Britannic missed by the accident of her timetable. She was the deadliest ship disaster that never quite was, saved from that title by the single circumstance that when the mine found her, her beds were empty. There is no comfort in it, only a kind of vertigo, the sense of having looked over the edge of a far greater darkness than the one that actually came to pass. In the aftermath, as with every great wreck, there were questions, and there were men determined to answer them. How had the safest ship afloat gone down so fast? The inquiries and the analyses that followed pieced together the story you have now heard. The great forward wound, the door that would not close, and above all the open portholes along the lower decks that had let the sea in from the side and defeated the whole logic of her watertight design. The lesson was plain and bitter. The ship had not failed. Her steel had held, her bulkheads had done their work as far as they were allowed to, her boats and davits had performed. What had beaten her was the gap between the ship as designed and the ship as run, the open windows and the open doors of a working hospital vessel in wartime, the human reality that no drawing board can fully account for. And there was one more question, the kind that clings to every wartime sinking, and it deserves an honest answering because rumour has muddied it for a century. Some of the survivors were convinced that morning that the Britannic had not struck a mine at all, but had been torpedoed, deliberately attacked, a marked hospital ship murdered by an enemy submarine. In the fear and the shock and the propaganda of the war, the idea took hold and spread, the story of the treacherous strike against a ship of mercy. But the evidence, weighed carefully in the calm of later years, comes down firmly on the side of the mine. The submarine that had sown that channel, U-73, had laid her field of mines weeks earlier and had long since left those waters for her distant base, and no enemy submarine is recorded as having been anywhere near the Kea Channel on the morning the Britannic died. The damage to the ship matched a mine. The German records described the minefield. The torpedo, in all likelihood, was a thing conjured by frightened people in a terrible hour, a way of making sense of a blow that came out of nowhere. It was the mine. A blind, patient, moored iron sphere, laid to catch whatever came, that caught, in the end, the largest ship in the world and a shipload of nurses and doctors and stokers, and cared nothing at all for the red crosses on her sides. And perhaps that is the honest place to leave the question of blame, which every great disaster invites and few ever answer well. It is tempting to look for someone to hold responsible for a thing this large, the enemy who laid the mine, the nurses who opened the portholes, the captain who made his run, the designers who left a door that could fail. But the closer you look, the more the blame dissolves into a chain of ordinary acts, each one reasonable, each one small, none of them wrong on its own. The submarine commander was fighting a war and laying mines against warships, as his side did, and the other side did too. The nurses were caring for the sick. The captain was saving his people. The designers had built the safest ship they knew how to build. There is no single hand to point at, and that absence is itself the lesson. The Britannic was not murdered, and she was not neglected. She was simply overtaken by the sum of 100 small and blameless things, in a war that had turned the whole sea into a trap, and that is a harder and a truer thing to sit with than any villain would have been. The Britannic went to the bottom of the Kea Channel, and the war rolled on over her memory, and for a long time the world half forgot her. This third sister, whose death was swallowed by the vaster death of the war around it. She lay in the dark and the cold, 400 feet down, and the years passed, and the men who had sailed in her grew old, and the great story of the Titanic grew and grew in the telling until it filled the whole world's imagination, and her larger, stranger sister sank quietly out of memory into the deep. But she was still there. She had never gone anywhere. And one day, a man in a red cap would come looking for her and find her and bring her back into the light. For nearly 60 years, she lay forgotten in the dark until a Frenchman in a red cap went looking for her. His name was Jacques Cousteau, and by the middle of the 1970s, he was the most famous ocean explorer alive. A man who had spent his life turning the hidden world beneath the waves into something ordinary people could see. In the autumn of 1975, he brought his ship into the Kea Channel and began to sweep the seabed, searching for the great wreck that the records said lay somewhere below. He found her, 400 feet down in the cold green dark of the channel. The Britannic lay where she had come to rest on that November morning almost 60 years before. And when the divers went down to her the following summer, making dive after dive to the wreck across that season, they found something that stopped the breath. She was almost whole. This is the strange gift of the way she died, and the film should let it land as wonder before it turns to grief. The Titanic, sinking in the deep Atlantic, had torn herself apart on the long fall to the bottom, breaking in two and driving her broken halves into the seabed miles down. The Britannic did no such thing. She had gone down in shallow water, close to the surface by the standards of the deep ocean, rolling onto her side rather than plunging, and she had come to rest on the floor of the channel very nearly intact, 1/8 of a mile of ship lying on her starboard flank in the green half-light. She is, to this day, the largest intact passenger liner lying anywhere on the floor of any sea in the world. She is, in a real sense, the ship the Titanic would have been if the Titanic had not destroyed herself in the dying. The great Olympic-class giant preserved whole, resting on her side in the Aegean dark, her vast hull stretching away into the gloom farther than a diver's light can reach. To go to her now is one of the great and dangerous pilgrimages of the diving world. She lies too deep for ordinary divers, in cold water with a current running, at a depth that pushes the very limits of what a human being can survive on the most advanced breathing gear. And those who make the journey down to her speak of it the way climbers speak of the highest mountains, as a thing that demands everything and forgives nothing. Down there in the dark, they move along her flank, past the rows of portholes, some still closed and dogged tight, and some, here and there, still standing open, exactly as the nurses left them on that warm morning a century ago. The small brass mouths through which the sea came in, fixed now forever in the position that helped to drown her. There is no more eloquent thing in the whole story than that. A diver hanging in the green dark beside the largest wreck in the world, and there before him, a single open porthole, still open, still letting the sea run through the giant it killed. The scale of her down there is hard to hold in the mind, even for the divers who have seen it. She lies in something close to 400 feet of water, and she is more than 800 feet long, which means she is longer than the water she rests in is deep. A ship so vast that when she went down, her bow reached the seabed, while her stern still stood in the air. To move along her on a single dive is impossible. A diver can visit only a small stretch of her before the cold and the depth and the ticking limits of the breathing gear force a turn for the surface. And so no one has ever simply looked at the whole of her at once, the way you might look at a building. She is too big for that. She has to be visited in pieces, remembered in fragments. A wall of steel here, a row of portholes there, the great gantry davits still standing against the current, the vast flank stretching away into a darkness the light cannot fill. She is not a relic. She is a leviathan, whole and asleep on her side, the ship the Titanic never got to become, kept by the cold Aegean almost exactly as she was on the morning she fell. She has an owner now, in the odd way that some famous wrecks do, a maritime historian named Simon Mills, who holds the rights to her and who has spent much of his life studying and guarding her memory, granting the careful expeditions that go down to survey her and turning away the rest. And in recent years, the divers have begun, with permission and with great care, to bring small pieces of her back up into the light, artifacts lifted from the wreck for study and for museums, so that people who will never make that terrible dive can stand before a real object that went down with her and feel, for a moment, the reality of the thing. Among the pieces that have come up from her in the years just past is her bell, raised from the great wreck in the Channel and brought up through 400 feet of water into the Greek sunlight. A piece of the largest ship the world lost in all the war, carried home at last after more than 100 years in the dark. There is something fitting in the bell coming up first, for a ship's bell is her voice, the thing that marked her hours and called her watches and would have rung out across the water in fog to tell the world that she was there. To raise that bell from 400 feet of Aegean dark, more than a century after it last sounded, is to give the Britannic back a little of her voice, to let the world hear from her one more time. She was so long forgotten, so completely overshadowed by her famous sister, that for most of a century she was little more than a footnote, the other one, the one that also sank. The wreck and the bell and the careful expeditions that go down to her are slowly changing that, drawing her back out of the shadow of the Titanic and into a story of her own, which is the strangest and in some ways the more instructive of the two. Because the Titanic teaches the world that the sea can kill. The Britannic teaches the harder lesson that even knowing it, even preparing for it with everything you have, may not be enough. She is not a legend on the seabed. She is a real ship, whole and cold and reachable, lying on her side where she fell, and the sea has kept her almost perfectly, as though to make sure the lesson of her would not be lost. Because there is a lesson in her, lying there intact in the dark. And it is not quite the lesson the world took from the Titanic, and it is harder and quieter and truer. And it is the thing this whole long story has been sailing toward from its very first minute. To find it, you have to go back up out of the cold green dark, back up the 400 feet and across the 60 years and the calm, bright morning, back to the instant the giant gave her first slow lurch to starboard, and ask again the question the whole film began with. Not whether she was safe, what walked her under so fast. The world had taken its worst disaster, studied it, and rebuilt the very same ship to be unsinkable. That is the fact to end on, because everything in this story bends back toward it. After the Titanic, the grief and the shame and the inquiry all poured into a single magnificent answer. A third sister of the same blood, armoured against every death the sea had ever shown. A double skin along her belly. Watertight walls raised 40 feet toward the sky. Boats enough for every soul aboard, and great cranes to launch them however she rolled. She was not a hope. She was an argument, made in steel, that the disaster would never come again. And then, off a Greek island, on a calm, bright morning, that argument sank in 55 minutes, faster than the disaster that made it, taken down not by any failure of her strength, but by open windows and open doors and the sea's genius for finding the one way in that no one had thought to close. That is the truth the Britannic leaves behind her, and it is a colder truth than the one the Titanic taught. The lesson of the Titanic was simple and almost comforting. Build it stronger, raise the walls, add the boats, and you will be safe. The lesson of the Britannic is that you can do all of that, do it perfectly, spend the grief and the money and the genius, and build the safest ship the world has ever seen, and still lose her in under an hour, because safety was never really a property of the steel. It lived in the 10,000 small choices made aboard her while she floated, in whether a door was shut and a window was closed, in the ordinary decent acts of ordinary people who could not see the disaster coming. The sea does not learn. It does not read the inquiries or admire the improvements. It waits, patient and blind and indifferent, and it needs only one way in. And human beings, doing nothing wrong at all, will always leave it a door. This is not a comfortable thing to carry away from a story, and the film should not pretend that it is. People would rather believe that disasters have causes that can be fixed, that every wreck teaches a lesson that makes the next ship safe, that progress is real, and the sea can, in the end, be beaten by cleverness and care. The Titanic seemed to promise exactly that. Learn the lesson, raise the walls, add the boats, and the horror need never come again. The Britannic is the ship that breaks the promise, the second act that darkens the first, the proof that you can learn every lesson perfectly and still lose. And yet there is something in that hard truth that is worth more than the comfortable lie, because it asks the right kind of humility of the people who build and sail and trust in great machines. Not the humility of despair, but the humility of attention, the knowledge that safety is never finished, never guaranteed by any structure however grand, but has to be made again every single day, in every shut door and closed window, by ordinary people who will never see the disaster their small care prevents. And the thread the sea kept pulling on, through all three of these great sisters, came at last to rest, and her ending is the one the film should close upon. Violet Jessop, who had been aboard the Olympic when the warship struck her, and aboard the Titanic when the ice came, and aboard the Britannic when the mine found her, survived that third disaster as she had survived the other two, pulled living from the water with her skull fractured and her hair. She always believed, having saved her life by cushioning the blow. And she did the most extraordinary and the most ordinary thing of all. She went back to sea. She sailed again, for years, on the very ships of this family, and she lived a long life, and she grew old, and she died at last in her bed many decades after the Britannic went down, the only human being ever to survive all three of the great Olympic-class disasters. In her own account of that November morning, she remembered leaping from the boat as the propellers came for it, and being drawn under the ship and the blow to her head. And she wrote, in the plain way of someone who had made her peace with the sea, that she was sucked under the keel which struck her head, and that years later, a doctor, hearing her complain of headaches, discovered that she had once sustained a fracture of the skull. She said it almost lightly. A woman who had cheated the deep 3 times, mentioning her broken skull the way another person might mention an old scar. And there is the toothbrush, the small thing planted early that the sea treated so cruelly and could not, in the end, take from her. On the Titanic, she had gone into the boats with nothing and had suffered absurdly for the want of a toothbrush, and she had promised herself she would never be caught so again. On the Britannic, in the middle of the disaster, hurrying from her cabin as the great ship began to die, she had remembered and gone back for it. It is the human heart of the whole story, that small act, that a woman standing on the deck of the sinking Britannic, having already survived the 2 most famous ships of her age, took a moment to reach for a toothbrush. It is what people do. In the face of the vast and the indifferent, they reach for the small and the human, the ordinary thing they can hold, and they carry it with them out of the wreck. The sea took the largest ship in the world in 55 minutes and could not take that. She lived a long life after the sea, this woman who could not drown. She grew old, far from the water, and she kept her stories. And she died quietly in her bed, decades after the Britannic went down, having outlived not only all three of the great sisters, but very nearly the whole age that built them. Think of what she carried in her memory to the end. The shudder of the Olympic as the warship struck, the tilt of the Titanic's deck under the stars, and the weight of a stranger's baby in her arms, the blast in the Kea Channel, and the propellers rising, and the leap into the sea, and the blow to her head, and the small, hard fact of the toothbrush in her pocket. One woman, 3 disasters, one family of doomed giants, and she walked away from all of it and lived to be old. If there is any answer at all to the sea's great indifference, perhaps it is only that, the stubbornness of the people who go back, who carry their small human things out of the wreck and keep on living, in defiance of an ocean that will never once notice them. So end where it began, in the Kea Channel, past 8 in the morning, with the largest ship in the world giving her first slow lurch to starboard. She was the answer to the Titanic. She was the safest thing that had ever floated. Every lesson of that freezing April night was welded into her body, and none of it was enough, because the sea found a way in that no engineer had drawn, through open windows on a warm, bright morning, and walked a giant under in a third of the time her famous sister had taken to die. She lies on her side now, in 400 feet of green water, whole and cold and almost perfectly kept, an eighth of a mile of grief and genius resting on the floor of a foreign channel, with a single porthole still open in her flank. And the sea that took her moves over the place where she went down, calm and blue and utterly indifferent, exactly as it was that morning, exactly as it will always be, having learned nothing at all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay with the channel, because the sea has swallowed more giants than the Titanic, and each one has a truth like this one waiting in the dark. And tell me this in the comments. If you had stood on the Britannic's bridge that morning, would you have made Bartlett's desperate run for the island, or held her still and trusted the boats? Tell me where in the world you are watching from, and what you would have done. Every comment, every share, keeps these ships from being forgotten a second time.